So today's study is titled Sighing and Crying in Jerusalem. And it is related to what we are going to start, what we studied last week about Ezekiel chapter 1. Remember that vision of Ezekiel? But we're going to look at some additional aspects. And this is related to the prophecy of Habakkuk. We're going to study the book of Habakkuk. And this is all the background to studying the book of Habakkuk. Because when we study Habakkuk and we have had this background, we will be able to understand the book of Habakkuk a little better. Okay? So with that in mind, let's move on. The guiding principle in Ezekiel. Now, a global cataclysm is coming and the wicked will have no refuge. Notice the reaction of the wicked or the lost to this coming disaster. Let's read Revelation 6, verses 14 to 17.
Then the sky receded as a scroll when it rolled up, and every mountain and island was moved out of its place. And the kings of the earth, the great men, the rich men, the commanders, the mighty men, every slave, every free man, hid themselves in the caves and in the rocks of the mountains, and said to the mountains and rocks, fall on us and hide us from the face of him who sits on the throne and from the wrath of the Lamb. For the great day of his wrath has come, and who is able to stand?
So there is a question that verse 17 asks, who is able to stand? Now, since everybody is going to be hiding in caves and pleading for the rocks and the mountains to fall on them, then the question is, who in this terrible calamity will be able to stand without having the fear and wanting the rocks and the mountains to fall on them? Now, Revelation 7, now this is Revelation 6:14, no? The very next chapter, the verses 1 to 4, give us the answers to this question. Okay? The question, what is the question? For the great day of his wrath has come, who is able to stand? Now that's the question. So only those we find in verses 7, chapter 7, verses 1 to 3, only those who are sealed will be protected from this coming global cataclysm. Now that what is this? It's talking about the second coming of Jesus. Only those who will be able to stand are those who will be found in verses 1 to 3 in Revelation chapter 7. Let's read that and see.
After these things, I saw 4 angels standing at the 4 corners of the earth, holding the 4 winds of the earth, that the wind should not blow on the earth, on the sea, or on any tree. Then I saw another angel ascending from the east, having the seal of the living God, and he cried with a loud voice to the 4 angels to whom it was granted to harm the earth and the sea, saying, do not harm the earth, the sea, I can't read the lines, Nina. Do not harm the earth, the sea, or the
trees, till we have sealed the servants of our God on their foreheads. Okay? So now what the angel is saying is, don't bring this calamity unless we have sealed the faithful of God on their foreheads. Now, why the foreheads, children? Remember, foreheads is where behind the foreheads you get the frontal lobe where we make conscious decisions, right? So until we seal them there. So then the purpose of the sealing that we are talking about, is to protect those who are sealed from the calamities that are going to fall on the earth, that are being described in chapter 6 of Revelation, chapter 6 of the book of Revelation. Okay? Now, the guiding principle in Ezekiel, the guiding principle in Ezekiel is that we need to apply, right? To apply when studying this story from Ezekiel. In Revelation, we have to apply this guiding principle that we study from Ezekiel as a comparison to Revelation, right? So the backdrop of Revelation 7:1, who will be able to stand? Who are these seals? Is found in Ezekiel chapter 8 and chapter 8 and chapter 9. So then what must we do? We need to return there to Ezekiel 8, 9. And to understand Revelation, the antitype. In the Bible, you have types and then the antitype. So you get the shadow and the reality. So for us to understand the reality better, we need to understand what the Old Testament type or the shadow was talking about, right? So we must understand Ezekiel 9, which describes the type that was fulfilled. This type was fulfilled with literal Israel or literal Jews in literal Israel, right? This was something that was fulfilled with the literal Jews in literal Israel. However, in the book of Revelation, Revelation 7:1-3 is describing the antitype, the reality, the final thing, right? And that will be fulfilled with spiritual Jews in global Jerusalem. So after AD 34, it became spiritual Israel. It became God's Christian church, all those who call themselves Christians. And all the Christians now not in one local place. They are all over. It's a global wide movement, right? So for us to understand Revelation 7:1-3 is to first. So for that, we need to go to Ezekiel 8 and 9, right? So that is what we're going to do now. Let's go and see what it says. Now the question is, in Ezekiel, when you study the book of Ezekiel, you find that Ezekiel was in a terrible apostasy. So the question is, who was to blame for the apostasy among God's people in the book of Israel in literal Jerusalem? In the Old Testament, remember, it's literal. So who was to blame for this apostasy, for the people not following God as they should, right? So we have, remember, literal Jerusalem, literal Israel, with literal people. I mean, it was a localized thing, and it was taking place with literal Israel. Now, the literal Jews are those who profess to serve God. They were the ones who professed to serve Jehovah in the Old Testament. They were God's people. Now, the main guilt was with the religious leaders. Why? Because they misguided the people, right? So the religious leaders in this Jewish nation misguided the Jews, the Jews who were part of God's system. So the religious leaders in Israel were particularly guilty of misleading the people into apostasy. But the thing is, the people in turn love to have it that way. They love to be in apostasy. But the leaders were the ones who are encouraging them and leading them to go against God's commands. Now, how do we know this? Let's go to Jeremiah chapter 5, verse 31.
The prophets prophesy falsely, and the priests rule by their own power. And my people love to have it so. But what will you do in the end?
Okay, so this is Jeremiah the prophet speaking. So the people these days, during this time, they trusted the religious leaders blindly. If the religious leaders said the sky is red, they believed that it was red, right? And they believe everything they said from the pulpits, because they say this is a spiritual leader. This person has to have it right? So no doubt about it. But the people in the days of Ezekiel were in apostasy because of what was being done by prophets and the priests who were the religious leaders of Israel. So we find that the religious leaders and the prophets of Israel, certain prophets, were leading the people astray. Now let's read Ezekiel 22, verse 20.
Ezekiel 22:26. Her priests have violated my law and profaned my holy things. They have not distinguished between the holy and unholy, nor have they made known the difference between the unclean and the clean. And they have hidden their eyes from my Sabbaths, so that I am profounded among them.
Okay, so here God is speaking through his prophet. God is saying, her priests, talking about Israel, have violated my laws, right? What a picture. And profaned my holy things, right? So we find that Ezekiel 22:26 is depicting a picture, painting a picture that the religious leaders were profaning, means they were breaking the Sabbath, right? And that they were teaching the people, they were actually not teaching the people to be able to distinguish, to identify what was right, what was holy, and what was common, what was not holy, right? So they were not teaching the people to distinguish that which was holy and that which was common. So they were violating the laws of God. They were breaking the laws of God. And they were profaning, they were bringing disrespect to God's whole, to what God had called holy. And that was the condition of the people during the days of Ezekiel. So we find this entire nation of Israel, they were in apostasy, openly breaking God's law, right? And the priests were teaching them and encouraging them to do that. Now, that is the picture that we find here in the background to Revelation 17, which is in Ezekiel. Now, let's go quickly through a summary of the book of Ezekiel, chapters 1 to 12, right? Chapter 1, now we did chapter 1 last week. We find that a chariot comes from the north. Now, why is the north significant? The north is where heaven is, right? So God comes from the north or from heaven to the Jerusalem temple to perform a work of investigative judgment. God is coming in. People are in apostasy. So God is coming from heaven to find out. Now, not that God doesn't know, but God always performs an investigation so that his people will know, right? So that his people will know this is wrong and this is what it should be. So we find God sits on his throne. God is surrounded by the cherubim, and a man's hand under the wing guides their movement. So we find that Jesus is guiding their movement. The Father is sitting on the throne, and the Holy Spirit is working through the angels to perform this duty. That is what we saw in Ezekiel chapter 1. Now, this took place in the year 592 BC. Okay, then let's move on to chapter 2. Now, chapters 2 to 6 paint a very vivid description of the deplorable, the terrible spiritual condition of those who profess to serve God. So those who said that they are God's people, the Israelites, the terrible spiritual condition that they are in. So chapters 2 and 6 describe that condition, right? Then when we go to chapter 7, right? Because this apostasy was so much, right? Because of this apostasy that is described in chapters 2 to 6, God promised that destruction would come from the four corners of the land. Remember that there were angels with 4 heads looking in 4 directions. That means the entire world. Now, this is in Ezekiel 7, it says that God's destruction would come from the 4 corners of the land. Now, let's read Ezekiel 7, 1 to 4 and see what it is saying.
Moreover, the word of the Lord came to me, saying, And you, son of man, thus says the Lord God to the land of Israel, an end. The end has come upon the four corners of the land. Now the end has come upon you, and I will send my anger against you. I will judge you according to your works, and I will repay you for all your abominations. My eye will not spare you, nor will I have pity, but I will repay your ways, and your abominations will be in your midst. Then you shall know that I am the Lord.
Okay, so God in chapter 7 is saying, I'm going to bring destruction on you because of this abominations that you are causing. Now God, now what is God is saying in this verse is, now this is actually speaking about the land where Israel lived. This is local. Remember, Ezekiel is local and literal. Revelation is spiritual and global, right? So we find that Revelation picks up on this, and Revelation is going to apply what God says here to a global Christian world, to spiritual Israel, in other words, those who are the children of Israel. How we become children of Abraham when we embrace Jesus as our Savior and Lord. So this Ezekiel 7, 1 to 4 is going to be applied globally, as we saw in Revelation chapter 7, 1 to 4. Okay, so this is the background. This is the type. Revelation is the antitype, what will take place at the end of time. Now, what are these abominations? What are these abominations? For that, we need to go to chapter 8 of Ezekiel. Ezekiel, God describes this abomination, these terrible sins that Israel is committing in chapter 8. So remember, God promised the destruction of the city because of abominations that were being committed or done by those who professed to be God's people. They're calling themselves God's people. So this chapter 8 describes the escalating list of abominations in order of gravity. So now it is not just one sin. It's so many sins, and the gravity, the deepness of their abominations and their sins, the apostasy rises in gravity, in what it is. It becomes greater in sin, right? So as we find, as God, and when you read this chapter, you see God is going to show Ezekiel these abominations, and as it indicated in the expression, I will show you abominations greater than these. So that there are abominations, there are great abominations, and there are greater abominations. So God shows Ezekiel an abomination that is being committed in the city. And then we see Ezekiel responding and says, "Wow, Lord, that is terrible. That's a terrible sin that they are openly committing." And then God said, "Ezekiel, you haven't seen anything yet. There are greater abominations, greater sins than these." And so throughout this chapter, it's very interesting. Well, read Ezekiel chapter 8. We have a list of abominations that get greater and greater and greater, and end, culminate in the greatest abomination. And we are going to see what that is in a moment. Now, the word abomination, there's a very close relationship to idolatry, right? To idol worship. Let's read about idol worship in Deuteronomy chapter 7, verses 25 and 26.
Deuteronomy chapter 7, 25 to 26. You shall burn the carved images of their gods with fire. You shall not covet the silver or gold that is on them. Nor take it for yourself, lest you be snared by it, for it is an abomination to the Lord your God. Nor shall you bring an abomination into your house, lest you be doomed to destruction like it. You shall utterly detest it and utterly abhor it, for it is an accursed thing.
Okay, so God, here Moses is writing, God is telling them, don't bring any carved images, right? Don't covet the silver or gold in those images. Don't bring them into your house, right? Because they are a detestable and a cursed and abhorred thing, right? So idolatry is something that God does not encourage, right? So what is abomination relating to? It's relating to idolatry or idol worship, right? Now let's talk about the greatest abomination that the Jewish people during the time of Ezekiel, just before they went into captivity, were committing. Now, Ezekiel and Daniel are contemporaries, right? Daniel was taken in the first siege, and Ezekiel was taken in a second siege, right? So, before the reason why Israel went into captivity was because of this, because of the sin she was committing. But this particular one was the greatest of great abomination. So, what was the greatest abomination that was being committed? Now, remember, it was not being committed by the people, the heathens. It was being committed by those who call themselves Christians and who serve God. Now, at the top of the list of abominations committed in the city was the religious leaders worshipping the literal sun. Now, God promised that this abomination would lead to desolation. Now, abomination is a terrible sin that is committed. And God said, when you commit this particular sin, I'm going to destroy you. That's what desolation, destruction brings in desolation, right? So that's why the term abomination of desolation, right? When you hear that, they are committed a great sin, they end up with destruction. So to speak, sun worship was the last straw that broke the camel's back. That was the last abomination, right? The drop that filled the cup, right? So God, they are turning their backs and worshiping the literal sun was the last thing that in their list of abomination before their destruction. Now let's read about this terrible abomination, the greatest of all sins that they committed. It's found in Ezekiel chapter 8, verses 16 to 18.
So he brought me into the inner court of the Lord's house. And there at the door of the temple of the Lord, between the porch and the altar, were about 25 men with their backs toward the temple of the Lord and their faces toward the east. And they were worshipping the sun toward the east.
Okay, so this is happening inside the very church even today. So what are these men doing? Now, remember when we did the sanctuary, we did a study on the sanctuary. You enter the sanctuary from the east. So that means your back is turned to idolatry. You're turning your back to sun worship and you're coming. So when you come into the sanctuary, you're facing west, right? You're looking to Jesus, because the sanctuary, in the sanctuary, you get the altar burnt offering, then you get the laver, then you get the inner sanctuary with the holy place and the most holy place. The most holy place had the Shekinah, God's presence there. So you turn your back to apostasy when you enter the temple. Now, what are these people doing? They have turned their back to God, where the Shekinah was in the temple, and they are worshipping the literal sun. Okay? So God says, because of this great sin along with all the other abominations, the idolatry, and all the other abominations that they're doing that is listed in Ezekiel 8, I am going to destroy the sick. Remember, abomination leads to desolation. Desolation is another word for destruction. So God promised this desolation because of this culminating sin of sun worship, right? So let's read Ezekiel 8, verses 17 to 18. That tells us about it.
And he said to me, have you seen this, O son of man? Is it a trifling thing to the house of Judah to commit the abominations which they commit here? For they have filled the land with violence. Then they have returned to provoke me to anger. Indeed, they put the branch to their nose. Therefore, I also will act in fury. My eye will not spare, nor will I have pity. And though they cry in my ears with a loud voice, I will not hear them.
So God is saying, is this a trivial thing? Is this a small thing that they are doing? House of Judah, they're committing these abominations. They have filled the entire land with violence, and they are provoking me to anger, because the God had told them specifically not to, that idol worship was an abomination, Sabbath was sacred, and if they break it, God had shown them what was going to happen. But what did they do? They put the nose to the branch, means they were saying, in your face, God, we will do what we want. So God said, God said, you are committing these abominations, you are calling yourself my people. I am going to bring destruction for you. So why were they worshipping idols? Why were they worshipping idols? Because, the reason why they were worshipping idols, because they had forgotten who their creator was, right? They forgot the creator. They forgot that God is supreme. God is the one who created us, and we are the creatures. They had forgotten that. And when you forget your creator who created you, you think you're smart, right? Is the world like that today? Very much so, right? So these priests during the time of Ezekiel had forgotten who the creator was, right? That is why they are worshipping idols. That is why they turn their face and they're worshipping the literal sun. That was created by God. Now you and I might think it's funny and we are not going to do it, but listen, we are going to learn about how we can, if we don't look sharp, we can also be like that. Now, what is the relationship between creation and worship? There has to be a relationship between creation and worship. What is it? Now, God had given Israel the Sabbath. He had given it to them as a reminder or a sign that he had set them apart. The Sabbath told them and the nations around them that they were set apart to be God's people. So when they worshipped on the Sabbath, on the seventh-day Sabbath, they were acknowledging that they were a group of people that had been set apart by God to do his work, right? And God had set them apart, right? For himself. And that he was the only true creator. There is no other creator. God was creator. He had set his people apart by giving them the sign or reminder of the Sabbath. Now, if Israel had kept the Sabbath, we are told, she would never have fallen into idolatry. She would never have she would have forever remembered that God was her creator. Now, that's the same for you and me today as well. If we remember that God is our creator, then our desire to worship on the Sabbath, to keep the 24 hours of the Sabbath day holy, becomes a pleasure for us. Now, listen to this great statement that comes from the pen of inspiration to this effect. Let's read the Great Controversy, page 438, and see what God's prophet has to say to us.
Had the Sabbath been universally kept, man's thoughts and affections would have been led to the Creator, as the object be an idolate, an atheist, or an infidel. The keeping of the Sabbath is a sign of loyalty to the true God, him that made heaven and earth and the sea and the fountains of waters. It follows that the message which commands men to worship God and keep his commandments will especially call upon them to keep the fourth commandment.
Okay, so what sign did God establish at creation? Now, this was not with the Jews when they came out of Egypt. This was a sign that God gave right at the beginning of time for in Earth's history at creation, God gave Adam and Eve this sign that he was their creator. Now, Adam and Eve didn't see God creating, but God told them that he was the creator and he gave them a Sabbath for them to acknowledge that he was the creator, right? So at the end of the creation week, on the seventh day, God rested with them. And after he rested, he blessed it and hallowed it. And then he said, this is the Sabbath. Why? Because I have rested on it. So the Sabbath in Exodus 31 is called a sign between God and Israel. It was a reminder, the weekly reminder that God was their creator, right? And if they had always kept the Sabbath, they would never have worshipped other gods, especially the sun god, because God created the sun. So they gave their allegiance and worship to the one who created these things. But what did they do? They didn't remember who God was, that he was their creator. So that's what took them down this road to apostasy. Now, notice the relationship between creation and worship. We are still talking about that. Let me ask you, why do we worship the creator? Why do creatures, we are creatures, right, worship the creator? We worship, well, because he's just that. He's the creator. Let's see what David in Psalms 95, 1-6 has to tell us about why we worship God. We worship him because he's the creator. So let's read Psalms 95, 1-6.
Psalms 95, 1-6. Oh, come, let us sing to the Lord. Let us shout joyfully to the rock of our salvation. Let us come before his presence with thanksgiving. Let us shout joyfully to him with psalms. For the Lord is the great God and the great King above all gods. In his hand are the deep places of the earth, the heights of the hills, and are his also. The sea is his, for he made it, and his hands formed the dry land. Oh, come, let us worship and bow down. Let us kneel before the Lord our Maker.
So why do we kneel before the Lord our Maker? Because he is our creator and he deserves our worship, right? So we'll come, we'll shout, we'll sing, we'll joyful, we'll bring thanksgiving because God created us and he deserves our worship, right? Now, Ezekiel 20, jumping to chapter 20, repeatedly describes Sabbath desecration, that is breaking the Sabbath, as the reason for Israel. This is talking about the literal Jewish nation, constant waywardness from God, constantly going away from God, constantly going into apostasy, was the main reason was the Sabbath desecration. Now let's read this. It's a bit of an extensive passage. Let's read the entire passage because it's of its importance of the Sabbath that is mentioned in this passage, where it says the reason why they went, literal Israel went into apostasy captivity was because they had forgotten the sacredness of Sabbath. They desecrated the Sabbath. So let's read Ezekiel 20 verses 12 to 20.
Moreover, I also gave them my Sabbaths to be a sign between them and me, that they might know that I am the Lord who sanctifies them, sets them apart. Yet the house of Israel rebelled against me in the wilderness. They did not walk in my statutes. They despised my judgments, which, if a man does, he will live by them, and they greatly defiled my Sabbaths. Then I said, I would pour out my fury on them in the wilderness to consume them. But I acted for my name's sake, that it should not be profaned before the Gentiles in whose sight I had brought them out. So I also raised my hand in an oath to them in the wilderness, that I would not bring them into the land which I had given them, flowing with milk and honey, the glory of all lands, because they despised my judgments and did not walk in my statutes, but profaned my Sabbaths, for their heart went after their idols. 17 Sabbaths, for their heart went after their idols. Nevertheless, my eyes spared them from destruction. I did not make an end of them in the wilderness, but I said to their children in the wilderness, do not walk in the statutes of your fathers, nor observe their judgments, nor defile yourselves with their idols. I am the Lord your God. Walk in my statutes. Keep my judgments and do them. Hallow my Sabbaths, and they will be a sign between me and you, that you may know that I am the Lord your God.
So when we kept, so do you know why it's his Sabbath? Why God says it's his Sabbath? Because he was the one who rested on the seventh day first. It's his Sabbath before it was ours. On the creation week, God finishes creation. At the end of the sixth day, then the seventh day, he rested. Rested means he sat with Adam and Eve and spent time with them. He studied with them, he shown them nature. I don't know, they would have the best Sabbath they could have had. And after he rested on the Sabbath day, at the end of the Sabbath day, he blessed that day. Why? Because he rested on it. Now, did he rest on any other day? No. The Bible tells that God worked on all the other 6 days. But Sabbath he rested. And because he rested, he blessed it. So that was his day because he rested on it. Right? So first, it is his Sabbath. Then the beginning of the second week of this earth's history, Adam's first week, God gives Adam, here is the week. You work Sunday to Friday. Saturday is the Sabbath. That is my time, 24 hours. Why? So that you remember that I am the creator and you honor me. And Sabbath is holy because I rested on it first and I'm giving it to you, right? So we keep the Sabbath. When we keep the Sabbath, we are recognizing that we are God, separated people, dedicated people, and that God is our God, and that God is our creator, right? So Israel's history, it's a history of one of constantly, not once, constantly desecrating the Sabbath, which should have been a reminder to them of who the Creator was. And it made it impossible for them, and it made it, impossible if they had remembered that God was the Creator. It would have made it impossible for them to worship idols, particularly the sun, because they would have known that God is the one who created it, and the Creator is always greater than the creation that he did. But they forgot that. They didn't recognize him as the Creator. Now moving on. This is chapter 9. Now that was chapter 8. So their greatest sin was breaking the Sabbath. Now let's go to chapter 9 of Ezekiel. But, not everybody in the city of Jerusalem was practicing false worship and the abominations. Not everyone was breaking the Sabbath or were steeped in idolatry. So when the destruction came, wouldn't it have been unfair to have destroyed those who were faithful to God? It would have been very unfair, right? If God had destroyed them for being faithful to him with those who were unfaithful. So what did God say? God says, we are going to separate a group by placing a seal on them. So this group who had been fallen into apostasy, who worship God as the Creator, who didn't worship idols, God says, I'm going to separate them by sealing them, right? By placing a seal on them. And then when the destruction comes, they will be protected from the destruction because of the seal they have. So chapter 9 of Ezekiel is describing this sealing that is taking place of the faithful in Jerusalem, in the city, before God destroys them because of the abominations that they are committing. So let's read Ezekiel 9, verses 1 to 4.
Then he called out in my hearing with a loud voice, saying, "Let those who have charge over the city draw near, each with a deadly weapon in his hand." And suddenly 6 men came from the direction of the upper gate, which faces northeast, with his battle axe in his hand. Once one man north, each with his battle axe in his hand. One man among them was clothed with linen and had a writer's icon. At this side, they went in and stood beside the bronze altar. Now the Lord of the God, now the glory of God, now the glory of God of Israel had gone up from the cherub where it had been to the threshold of the temple. And he, the Lord, called to the man clothed with linen, who had the writer's icon at his side. And the Lord said to him, "Go through the midst of the city, through the midst of Jerusalem, and put a mark on the foreheads of the men who sigh and cry over all the abominations that are done within it."
Okay, right. So now, by the way, remember, this description of sealing is a description of the Day of Atonement, because it is separating the righteous from the unrighteous, right? Or the wheat from the tares, as we have in the parables in the New Testament, right? This happened on the Day of Atonement. Does this have any relationship to chapter 7 of the book of Revelation, which says putting a mark on the forehead? Absolutely. Now, it's not tattooing anything or something. Like I said, the forehead, behind the forehead is your frontal lobe. And it is with our frontal lobe that we make decisions. We think, we rationalize, and then we decide to do the right thing. So the sealing is the people of God have made conscious decisions to serve Him. So God is telling the angels, separate those who have made this conscious decision to serve me, whatever happens, right? So that is, remember, these are symbolic, right? The incorn and the writer's incorn and all are symbolic, but what is saying that people are making conscious decisions to serve God and keep the Sabbath. Now here's the characteristic. Who are those who are going to be sealed? Those who are sighing and crying over all the abominations that are being done within the city of Jerusalem. So there was this group who was so sad, disappointed, and discouraged because of all the false worship that was going on, particularly the worshipping of the sun god or the literal sun. So the man in linen, if you have a concordance and you refer it, the man in linen appears to be Jesus Christ. Now, at this point, we know why God came to Jerusalem in chapter 1, right? He came to perform a judgment. Judgment is to separate, right? Separate the righteous from the unrighteous before the destruction of the city. So the description is that of a work of a high priest. It was the high priest who, on the Day of Atonement, went into the most holy place, right? That is found in Leviticus chapter 16. When the faithful who afflicted their soul are retained, they are kept as members of God's people, and those who were not, who didn't have this mark, who actually were superficial, they just call themselves children of God, they were cut off from God's people and they were destroyed. So during the judgment in Ezekiel, in the book of Ezekiel, the faithful received the mark of God on their forehead. They made conscious decisions to worship the Creator and not the created thing. And the wicked, they did not. They continued in idolatry and they were destroyed. So regarding the high priest, who is the high priest? We find Moses wrote in Ezekiel chapter 16, verse 4. This would be a reference to Christ, because speaking about the high priest, this is what Moses says. He shall put the holy linen tunic, right? Linen tunic. Remember the man with dressed in linen? And the linen trousers on his body, and he shall be girded with a linen sash, and with a linen turban he shall be attired. These are holy garments. So linen is completely without artificial things. It was made from natural. So Jesus is the man clothed in linen. He is our high priest, right? And so this scene in Ezekiel 9 is describing the Day of Atonement, when the separation of the righteous from the unrighteous takes place with the sealing of those who cry and sigh, right? And then after they are sealed only, the destruction takes place, right? So are you catching the picture? Isn't it an interesting picture? God is coming from heaven to perform this separation of those who are holy from those who are unrighteous, so that he can destroy the abominations and the people who are committing the abomination. Now let's talk about the destruction promise. Now after this separation, those who sighed and cried from those who didn't, God promised to destroy the city and those who practiced abominations within the city. Let's read that in Ezekiel 9, verses 5 to 7.
To the others he said in my hearing, go after him through the city and kill. Do not let your eyes spare, nor have any pity. Utterly slay old and young men, maidens and little children and women. But do not come near anyone on whom is the mark, and begin at my sanctuary. So they began with the elders who were before the temple. Then he said to them, defile the temple and fill the courts with the slain. Go out. And they went out and killed in the city.
Now why begin at the sanctuary? Why? Who was guilty of apostasy? According to what we noticed in Ezekiel 8, it was the religious leaders. So they are much more responsible than the people whom they deceived. Why? Because people believed that they were the leaders and they knew better. So they were deceived by them. So God begins with the leader. But now we need to notice something. If we go back a little and see that something happened before this destruction came, right? I just want us to see that there is this sealing, and after the sealing comes the destruction. But we need to go forward to Ezekiel chapter 10. So the sealing takes place, and the ones who are sighing and crying are the ones who are sealed. Then God says, destroy them completely, begin with my sanctuary, begin with the religious leader. Now let's see what happens before. Scattering of the coals of fire. Now we are moved on to chapter 10 of Ezekiel. Now after the work of sealing was complete, okay, the most holy place. Now what was in the most holy place? The Shekinah glory, right? Remember the Shekinah glory resided there. That was the presence of God, representing the presence of God. Now, after this sealing takes place, the Shekinah departs. The Shekinah leaves the sanctuary, right? And when the Shekinah leaves the sanctuary, national apostasy. Now, it's not individual. It becomes nation-wide apostasy, led to national ruin, to the entire nation being destroyed, right? So the abomination that leads to desolation, which is fleeing, right? The man clothed in linen then poured out coals of the censer upon the city, and it was consumed. Now the siege by Nebuchadnezzar brought about a time of terrible trouble as Jerusalem had never experienced. God permitted Nebuchadnezzar to come and destroy the city because of the terrible apostasy that his people were committing. The faithful were in the city. But remember this, but their lives were spared. Why? Because they had the sign on their forehead. Now, this is referring to the high priest who waved the coals of fire, refers to the high priest. Remember, he had this censer when he was in the most holy place, who waved the censer before the Lord, representing the prayers of God's people. Remember, if the high priest puts incense on it, and when the incense, the smoke of the incense goes, it lifts up and goes over to the mercy seat, and it's the prayers of the people that are there, which are covered by Jesus' righteousness and taken before God's great throne of grace for his answers to prayer, right? So this the censer represents prayers of the saints. But now we find that this censer that is interceding on behalf of God's people is thrown down. Now, if there is no censer, then there is no way for the prayers of God's people to be covered with Jesus' righteousness. So, which means when the censer is thrown down, what it means is that there is no longer intercession taking place. Jesus has ceased interceding for his people, right? And this tells us that is the end of probation. People have made their decisions, those for God, those for Satan, and God ceases his interceding on behalf of his people. Now, let's talk about the Shekinah. The Shekinah, we know, is the presence of God. Now, the Shekinah is about to depart from the city. And when it departs from the city has no defense against Nebuchadnezzar. Who was their protector? Who was their defender? God, right? So when the presence of God leaves the city, there's no one to defend them, right? So the Nebuchadnezzar and his army, they come and destroy those who didn't sigh and cry because of their abominations, and God's protection has been withdrawn because his Shekinah has left. So in Ezekiel chapter 1 and 2, we find these words.
And I looked, and there in the firmament that was above the head of the cherubim, there appeared something like a sapphire stone, having the appearance of the likeness of a throne. Then he, the one seated on the throne, spoke to the man clothed with linen and said, "Go in among the wheels, the same chariot as the chapter 1, under the cherub. Fill your hands with coals of fire from among the cherub, and scatter them over the city." And he went in as I watched.
Okay, so what's going to happen now? The fire that was used to intercede, right, on behalf of God's people is going to consume the city. The coal no longer intercedes, and now it's cast on the city, and the city is going to burn because intercession has come to an end. Okay, now this is in literal Israel, and then comes Nebuchadnezzar and destroys them. This is the type, and we find the antitype in the book of Revelation, right? So we understanding this helps us to understand that better. Now the Shekinah lingered. Now after the Shekinah glory left the sanctuary, where it had been all the time over the Ark of the Covenant, it rose up, moved out of the sanctuary, and then it lingered, stopped a while on the Mount of Olives, east of Jerusalem. Remember, northeast is where heaven is. So east of Jerusalem, it stopped a while, as though it did not want to depart from the chosen city. God seemed to be saying, "How can I give you up, O Jerusalem?" Now let's read Ezekiel 11, 22 and 23.
So the cherubim left up their wings with the wheels beside them, and the glory of the God of Israel was high above them, and the glory of the Lord went up from the midst of the city and stood on the mountain which is on the east side of the city.
So now the Shekinah is departed, right? Then comes desolation, followed the abomination. Just to clarify these terms, abominations are sins they committed. Because of that, desolation came or destruction fell upon the people and their land. So what is the mountain east of the city? Like we said, the Mount of Olives. And what followed after the departure of the Shekinah from the city? 2 Chronicles 36, 17 to 19 is going to speak about the destruction of Jerusalem after their protection of God was withdrawn and it's destroyed by fire. Let's read 2 Chronicles 36, 17 to 19.
Therefore, he brought against them the king of the Chaldeans, who killed their young men with the sword in the house of their sanctuary, and had no compassion on young men, or virgin, or the aged, or the weak. He gave them all into the hand, and all the articles from the house of God, great and small, the treasures of the house of the Lord, and the treasures of the king and of his leaders, all these he took to Babylon. Then he burned the house of God, broke down the walls of Jerusalem, burned all its palaces with fire, and destroyed all its precious possessions.
All that happened because they turned away from God, right? The abominations brought that destruction. So does that mean that the city was destroyed because the people didn't keep the Sabbath? That's exactly what the Bible says. Although all the abominations in the city led to the desolation or the destruction, the desecration of the Sabbath was at the top of the list. 7 times the prophet Jeremiah warned Israel that trampling the Sabbath would lead to the burning of the city. Okay? Jeremiah lived before the destruction, right? So he was a prophet who warned. Remember that Jeremiah was the prophet, just before captivity, during the reign of King Josiah. Let's read Jeremiah chapter 17, verses 21 to 27.
Thus says the Lord, take heed to yourselves, and bear no burden on the Sabbath day, nor bring it in by the gates of Jerusalem, nor carry a burden out of your house on the Sabbath day, nor do any work, but hallow the Sabbath day, as I commanded your fathers. But they did not obey, nor incline their ear, but made their neck stiff, that they might not hear, nor receive instruction. And it shall be, if you heed me carefully, says the Lord, to bring no burden through the gates of this city on the Sabbath day, but hallow the Sabbath day to do no work in it. Then shall enter the gates of this city kings and princes, sitting on the throne of David, riding in chariots and on horses, they and their princes, accompanied by men of Judah and the inhabitants of Jerusalem. And this city shall remain forever. And they shall come from the cities of Judah and from the places around Jerusalem, from the land of Benjamin, and from the lowland, from the mountains, and from the south, bringing burnt offerings and sacrifices, grain offerings and incense, bringing sacrifices of praise to the house of the Lord. But if you will not heed me to hallow the Sabbath day, such as not carrying a burden when entering the gates of Jerusalem on the Sabbath day, then I will kindle a fire in its gates, and it shall devour the palace of Jerusalem, and it shall not be quenched.
What a warning, right? So did the destruction of the city have anything to do with the profanation of the Sabbath, breaking of the Sabbath, profaning the Sabbath? Absolutely. The city would have remained forever if they kept the Sabbath. Because in keeping the Sabbath, they would have been confessing their belief in the Creator. They would have been worshipping the Creator. It was a sign between God and Israel. It was a sign that He was their Creator and God. So clearly it is more than a day. The Sabbath is more than a day. It is evidence. It was evidence that whom they serve the Lord, right? That they were serving the Lord as Creator. But if they trampled on the Sabbath and they worshipped idols and they worshipped the sun, that means they were not accepting God, though they said they were God's people, and they forgot the Sabbath. They were not acknowledging God as their Creator and their protector, and God to be ruler over them, right? When they desecrated and profaned the Sabbath. Is that clear? Right. Now, this is what took place actually in literal Jerusalem. Okay. Now, let's apply this to the end time. Is it the same to worship the sun as it is to worship on Sunday? Is Sunday worship idolatry? Well, some people say there is no similarity. But do you know what? There is. Okay. Now, let's ask 3 questions about the sun first, right? So that we can understand this better. Okay. And then let's draw parallels with the sun and sun worship. Okay. Now, tell me, who created the sun? God, right? Was it created for worship? No.
No.
No, it was created for us. It was a secular object created to give light and to demark time, right? The sun gives us the year, right? And the moon gives us the month. So the sun and the day. So it was an object to give light, right? Then what happens if you take an object, right? And you worship this object. If you make it an object of worship, what happens if you take an object and you worship it? What is the name that you call that? It's called idolatry. You're worshipping an idol that is actually not meant to be worshipped. So you're worshipping something that is not meant to be worshipped, right? So if you worship the sun, it is idolatry because God created it. God didn't create it for worship. He created it for something else. But you are taking it as an object of worship, which is idolatry. And the Bible very clearly says idolatry is an abomination to the Lord. Now let's talk about the day, the sun day. I'm going to draw parallels here. Who created the first day of the week or the day of the sun? Who created the first day? Genesis 1:1 says, God created. Okay, so God created the first day. Did God create it for worship? No. He was working on that day. Remember what made the 7th day holy? The fact that he rested on it. Right? It is just another secular work day. Right? Part of the week. What happens if we make that day a secular day for worship? It becomes idolatry. They are worshipping an object that God has not created for worship. So can you see the parallel? Sun was created by God. It was not created for worship. But if you worship the sun, it's idolatry. The Sunday, the first day of the week, was created by God. It was not created for worship. But if you worship on that day, you are worshipping an idol. It becomes idolatry. Okay? So tell me, does it matter if it's an object or if it's a day? anything that man makes for worship, that God did not make for worship, is idolatry. You are putting in place a common object as an object of holiness, which God never made it for. So let's take two stories from the Bible to see how serious this is, how seriously God takes this. Let's talk about Belshazzar's sin, right? Now, it's a very serious matter for man to treat what is holy as if it is common, right? The last night of the Babylonian Empire illustrates this point. It is like the straw that broke the camel's back, something small that tipped the balance, right? Or like they say, a drop that filled the cup of Babylon's iniquity, right? And that was taking what was holy and treating it as it was a commonplace thing. Now, on the final night before the fall of Babylon, we find Belshazzar celebrating a banquet with thousands of his friends and princes and dignitaries. Now, remember, he was only 15 at this time, right? And he did something that was very serious, right? He called for the holy vessels of the sanctuary that Nebuchadnezzar brought during his siege of Babylon, right? He brought them to this feast. Now he was drunk. When a person is drunk, there's a reason. His reasoning powers are gone, right? So he brought these golden objects, the golden vessels, and to use them for a secular purpose. And what was that? To drink wine from them. So he and his concubines and his friends, they were having this riotous party. They were going to drink wine out of these sacred objects. Let's read this story in Daniel chapter 5, verses 1 to 4.
Daniel 5 verses 1 to 4. Belshazzar, the king of Babylon, made a great feast for 1,000 of his lords and drank wine in the presence of the 1,000. While he tasted the wine, Belshazzar gave the command to bring the gold and silver vessels which his father Nebuchadnezzar had taken from the temple, which had been in Jerusalem, that the king and his lords, his wife, and his concubines might drink from them. Then they brought the gold vessels and that had been taken from the temple of the house of God, which had been in Jerusalem, and the king and his lords, his wives, and his concubines drank from them. They drank wine and praised gods of gold and silver, bronze and iron, wood and stone.
Okay. Now tell me, did wine have anything to do with Belshazzar's decision that day? Yes, right? Now don't miss the point. The sin of the king followed 3 steps. First, he drank fermented wine. Second, the wine did not allow him to distinguish between the holy and the common. Finally, the result was false worship, to worship idols of gold, silver, bronze, and iron. Okay? Now let's see what happened to Belshazzar, right? His sin was that he took something that was holy and he treated it as common. Serious, right? Now let's see what happened to him in verses 22 to 24. Okay, so now this is Daniel talking to him. He said, now you, his son Belshazzar, have not humbled your heart, although you knew all this. Now, Belshazzar knew the testimony of Nebuchadnezzar, right? He was aware of it. And then Daniel says, and you have lifted yourself up against the Lord of heaven. You have brought the vessels of his house before you, and you and your lords, your wives and your concubines have drunk wine from them. And you have praised the gods of silver, gold, bronze, iron, wood, and stone, which do not see nor hear or know. And the God who holds your breath in his hand owns all your ways. You have not glorified. Notice Belshazzar knew what was right and wrong because he knew the story of his grandfather Nebuchadnezzar. How he became insane due to his arrogance, right? He was fully aware of this. So again, why was he not able to distinguish the holy from the uncommon? Because he was drunk with wine. Now we know that wine plays a role in the book of Revelation, but also in the book of Habakkuk, which we'll see once we start and go through this background and understand Habakkuk better. Now moving on. Next story, the sins of Nadab and Abihu. We have the other story. These were the sons of Aaron. Now they took something that was common and they presented it as holy. Belshazzar took something that was holy and used it as common. But these took something that was common and tried to pass it off as holy. Now God had instructed them that fire needed to be taken from the altar of sacrifice because God had rained the fire from heaven and it was holy. So God had instructed the priests of Israel to use only holy fire when they burnt incense in the presence of the Lord. Now, however, when Nadab and Abihu offered common fire in place of the holy, they were consumed, they died. The great sin was they took what was common and offered it as if it were holy. After their demise, God gave a special explicit instructions to Aaron. Now, let me ask you, if you looked at the fire, would it look just like fire? Yes, for sure. If you put your finger in that fire, would it burn your finger just like any kind of fire? Yes, absolutely. But if you study the chemical properties of both the fire, would they be alive? Yes. Then what made the fire that God rained on the altar holy fire? It was the fact that God had made it holy. Common fire might look like it, but it wasn't holy. And so verses 8 to 10 of in Leviticus, we find this. Let's read Leviticus 8 to 11.
Then the Lord spoke to Aaron, saying, "Do not drink wine or intoxicating drink, you nor your sons with you, when you go into the tabernacle of meeting, lest you die. It shall be a statute forever throughout your generations, that you may distinguish between holy and unholy, and between unclean and clean, and that you may teach the children of Israel all the statutes which the Lord has spoken to them by the hand of Moses."
Okay, right? So did Nadab and Abihu know this? They sure did, like Belshazzar. But they chose to ignore it and disobey a direct command of God. Now, Mrs. White repeatedly refers to Sunday worship as the worship of idol Sabbath. Let's read that and see.
Among professed Christians, there are idolatrous men and women who are not sealed by God. Many have subverted the Christian faith into idolatry, giving to man-made institution the glory and honor that God requires for his Sabbath day, and compelling others to worship this idol. Such ones will surely be visited with God's retributive judgments, which are to be poured out without mixture of mercy upon the unrepentant despisers of God's law.
Are you catching the picture now? Now, there are many Christians who are idolaters, right? But they don't know that they are idolaters by observing the day of the sun, which is a man-made institution for worship. So you know what human beings have done? They have taken a common day of work and they have made it holy, and they have taken a holy day and they have made it common, right? So if God accepts that, then he's going to have to apologize to Belshazzar and Nadab and Abihu, because the principle is the same. Can you see the significance of this, right? Now, let's talk about the Sabbath memorials, right? About memorials. It is a common knowledge that historical memorials must be observed on the same day, right? When the original event took place. It is true of the memorial that God established to commemorate creation. When we celebrate Independence Day in Sri Lanka, do we celebrate it on July 4th? No, we don't, right? Because as a country, we received independence on the 4th of February, 1948. So we commemorate the event every February 4th. The point is that we have to celebrate an original event on the same day on which it occurred. So we find that Pope John Paul II and Pope Benedict XVI, as well as Francis I, they have said that we need to keep Sunday in honor of the Creator. Is that even possible? No. Why? Because God didn't rest on the Sunday. He was working on the Sunday. Right? Sunday from creation was not God's rest day. It was a working day. It was a common day. He rested on the Sabbath day. And because he rested only, the Sabbath day is holy. So when we have to rest on the same day that God rested, then it becomes a memorial of creation. Let's read Prophets and Kings, page 111, this quotation.
The first 6 days of each week are given to man for labor, because God employed the same period of the first week in the work of creation. On the seventh day, man is to refrain from labor in commemoration of the Creator's rest.
Okay. Now quickly, Revelation 17. Now let's turn to Revelation 17 for the final global fulfillment, right? Of this Ezekiel type. The chapter describes a harlot who is committing abominations. It describes a harlot who is committing fornication with the kings of the earth. God promises that he'll make her desolate. She is identified as Babylon. She makes fermented wine and gives it to all the inhabitants of the planet. And as a result, they cannot distinguish between the holy and the common. And then they fall into idols. This is Revelation 17. In Bible prophecy, we know that a harlot, a woman, represents an apostate church, right? This is a church that claims to love and serve Christ, yet tramples upon the Sabbath and exalts the idolatrous Sunday. So the harlot represents an apostate church. She's a global church because she sits on nations, multitudes, tongues, and peoples. She mingles religion with politics because she fornicates with the kings of the world. She has daughters that came forth from her later in her history. She gives the abominable wine, which is of false doctrines to the world, which makes it impossible for them to distinguish between holy and secular day of worship. And as a result, they fall into idolatry. Now, this is not the wine that we talk about, Chardonnay, the literal wine, because at the end, Babylon represents a spiritual system, a global system. The wine represents spiritual fornication or false doctrine. We will study this later, right? She has a history of shedding blood of God's faithful people. She claims to have changed God's holy Sabbath day. But not everyone drinks her wine, right? The servants of God will sigh and cry because of the abominations that are committed, right? In the harlot, in the midst of the harlot, right? In this church. They will proclaim with a loud voice the first angel's message, which calls the world back again to worshiping the Creator. And multitudes will come out of Babylon and join the faithful remnant. The faithful will receive the seal of God on their foreheads. That means they will choose, right? And the wicked, the mark of the beast, which is on their hands and foreheads, that means actions and their decisions. Probation will then close. The time of trouble will ensue. And when the world is destroyed, they will be spared, those who are sealed, right? Now, Sabbath is a matter of authority. The final controversy will not be over days, a matter of days, because the day is behind the day is the issue of authority. When we keep the Sabbath, it is a sign that we are obedient to the Creator. And when we keep Sunday, it's a sign that we are obedient to the power who claims to have changed the day of worship to Sunday. It will be the same issue as in the Garden of Eden. Now, behind the issue of the tree was the matter of authority. To refrain from eating the fruit was a sign of respect and obedience to God's authority. Eating the fruit was a sign of respect and obedience to the serpent's authority. The tree was merely a way for God to test whose authority Adam and Eve obeyed. Sadly, Protestantism has never been able to totally sever her relationship with the mother from which she was born, the church from which she was born. She keeps some of her wine in the cellar. She still teaches, among other things, that the soul is immortal. The soul doesn't die. The Bible says, when we die, we sleep, that the dead are not dead. They believe in an immortal soul. She also adopts the idea that people go to hell when they die or burn forever, and that Sunday is a sacred day of it. Therefore, they will inevitably come back to their mother. Now I'm going to read this statement from John O'Brien, who for decades taught at the University of Notre Dame. He challenges the Protestants at the end of the statement, and he makes a very interesting remark. Let's read it. But since Saturday, not Sunday, is specified in the Bible, it is curious that non-Catholics who profess to take their religion directly from the Bible and not from the church observe Sunday instead of Saturday. Yes, of course, it is inconsistent. But this change was made about 15 centuries before Protestantism was born. And by that time, the custom was universally observed. They have continued the custom, even though it rests upon whose authority? The authority of the Catholic Church, and not upon the explicit text in the Bible. That observance remains a reminder of the mother church from which the non-Catholic sects broke away. Like a boy running away from home, but still carrying in his pocket a picture of his mother or a locket of her hair. Okay? So do you understand this study and how important Sabbath is? It is a matter of life and death. The Sabbath is the seal of God, the sign that the God we worship is the true God, and we owe him our worship because he's the creator. And every week we remember that. And that's the reason why the fourth commandment says, remember the Sabbath day to keep it holy. Why would God say, remember the Sabbath day to keep it holy? Because we might fall into forgetting the Sabbath, that the Sabbath is holy. So God wants us to keep Sabbath joyful, not force his wants. He doesn't want to force us, right? But to joyfully embrace the observance of Sabbath, not because we have to, but because we love our Lord and we want to please him and we want to obey his authority.